Welcome to Serene Mind Stories, your gentle nighttime sanctuary, where the world finally grows quiet and your mind can soften into calm. Tonight, before you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep, let me guide you into a realm touched by candlelight, soft magic, and timeless wonder. Take a slow breath in and let it go. Feel your shoulders ease, your thoughts settle, your whole being gently unwind. This is your moment to rest, to simply be. And now, when you're ready, we'll step together into the classic tale of Beauty and the Beast. A story of kindness, transformation, and the kind of inner beauty that glows far beyond appearances. A soothing journey to help your heart feel lighter and your dreams feel sweeter. If these quiet bedtime moments bring you comfort, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can share many more stories together. Now, relax, breathe softly, and let the tale begin. Part 1. There was once a merchant named Laurent who had invested everything he owned into a fleet of ships, only to lose them all to the sea. As a widower, he had no wife waiting for him at home, but he did have 6 children who had long enjoyed a life of comfort. When the creditors came calling and word spread that the family was ruined, most of the children took the news badly. Weeks passed with no sign of the missing ships, forcing Laurent to sell off their elegant furniture, the family carriage, and even his daughter's jewels and the fine dresses. They eventually had to leave their grand home and settle into a small cottage on the edge of town. Laurent was often away seeking out old business partners, hoping someone might help him rebuild what he had lost. During his travels, the children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, were left to manage the household on their own. They were nearly grown, yet the 3 boys and the 2 eldest girls were helpless with basic tasks, having been raised in comfort and leisure. The youngest daughter, Camille, was the only one willing to take responsibility now that they had no servants. Perhaps it was because she was younger, or simply because she had a gentler, steadier nature. Whatever the reason, Camille tried her best to learn everything required to keep the home running. Foreign to village life as they were, Laurent's older children had few companions in the area, and their aloofness didn't help. The 5 eldest made no effort to adapt. They refused to prove themselves capable or to connect with the neighbors who might have supported them. Camille, however, approached the villagers with questions about baking, sewing, gardening, and caring for chickens, skills she had never needed before. Their initial caution slowly warmed into affection as they saw her eagerness to learn and her willingness to work hard. In time, she became the quiet force that held Laurent's family together. While her siblings remained resentful and unchanged, Camille kept the cottage tidy and made sure meals were prepared. Nearly 2 years passed in this fashion before a message arrived. One of Laurent's missing ships had finally reached the port with most of its cargo intact. The family celebrated wildly, the older children declaring that their days among the villagers were finally over. Camille was glad to see them hopeful again, but the news didn't stir her in the same way. She had grown fond of their modest home, the neat garden, and the warm smell of bread baking. Although she wanted her family to thrive, she wasn't sure she wanted to return to a life of idleness. She had discovered she liked being useful. To reclaim his ship, Laurent needed to travel to the port on horseback, a journey of several days. Once there, he would arrange the sale of his recovered goods and hire a fine coach to bring him home. Before leaving, he asked his children what gifts they wanted from the city. The older ones immediately demanded luxury: silk shoes with sparkling buckles, lavish hats, velvet capes, furs, and jewelry. Only Camille said nothing at first, deep in thought. When her father encouraged her to speak, she hesitated. "In truth, father, I have always dreamed of seeing a rose," she said softly. "They do not grow here, and they are rare and costly. If you could bring me just one, any color, I would be so happy." Laurent chuckled at her unusual request and agreed. Privately, he planned to bring her a necklace or trinket as well, to accompany the flower. The weather was fair on the morning he set out. Camille packed his saddlebag with food for the road and wished him goodbye with teary warmth. The others were more indifferent. They were accustomed to his long trips and cared only about the gifts he would return with. Camille alone stood outside watching him disappear down the sunlit forest path. A faint uneasiness tugged at her, though she tried to ignore it. After all, their luck had finally seemed to turn. While Laurent's children waited back at the cottage, he travelled toward the port city, filled with hope of restoring his fortune. It was true that he had suffered immense losses, but with the cargo on this ship, he could start fresh, perhaps even rebuild a fleet. His mind swirled with dreams of spices, silks, and exotic goods he might someday trade again, which made it all the more crushing when he arrived and realized everything had fallen apart. Yes, the ship had returned with most of its cargo intact, but news of this had spread quickly, and his numerous creditors had acted even faster. By the time Laurent reached the port, his goods had already been seized and sold off to repay his debts. He went from merchant to merchant, pleading for more time, but every request was refused. By the end of the day, Laurent found himself free of debt, but with nothing left to his name. He had no funds to reinvest, and certainly nothing to buy the gifts he had promised his children. He was so discouraged that he couldn't bear to spend the night in the city. Without preparing supplies, checking the weather, or sending word ahead, he climbed back onto his exhausted horse and rode out of town, following the same provincial road he had travelled that morning. Laurent had been riding for several hours when darkness settled in and a violent storm broke overhead. Thunder cracked, lightning slashed across the sky, and fierce winds tore branches from the trees. Terrified, his horse bolted off the main road and carried him deep into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late how reckless it had been to travel at night, Laurent began searching desperately for shelter in the howling wind. Anything, even a cave, that might shield him from the storm. He had no idea how long his horse wandered through the tempest, until suddenly a tall stone wall loomed out of the darkness. Hoping it marked a home, he urged the horse forward. Instead of a cottage, he found himself before the towering boundary of an estate. A massive iron gate stood slightly ajar. With no time for courtesy, Laurent dismounted and shoved the heavy gate open wide enough to guide his horse through. Together, they moved up a paved path, stretching into the swirling shadows. With leaves whipping through the air and rain striking from every direction, Laurent could barely make out the shape emerging ahead, a huge mansion. Even with limited visibility, he could see its sweeping entrance, tall windows, and many grand rooms. It was hardly the sort of place one entered uninvited. But he had little choice. He doubted he could survive the night without a roof. He tied his horse under a covered alcove, then made his way to the enormous front door and lifted the iron knocker. The echo from the metal seemed to mingle with the thunder. When no one answered, he gathered his courage and pushed the door open. With all his strength, it yielded, and he nearly stumbled onto the floor of an expansive entry hall. Laurent stayed on the cold stone for a moment, catching his breath in the eerie stillness. The rain still hammered the steps outside, and he felt grateful his horse at least had shelter. Rising, he glanced around in the dimness. Twin staircases curved upward on either side, and suits of armor stood like silent guards. Ahead was a pair of elaborately carved double doors. The silence inside the mansion was so deep, he felt he could hear every breath. Yet a faint glow spilled from the cracks around the doors. After calling out a few times and hearing no response, he approached the lit room and slowly pushed the doors open. Warm firelight spilled out. In the massive hearth, flames roared. A small table had been set for one, a few simple dishes, a carafe, and a large cup neatly arranged. He scanned the rest of the room, noticing upholstered chairs and tables cluttered with books, but still no sign of the master of the house. Awkwardly, Laurent sat in an armchair and waited, but his attention kept drifting toward the meal on the table. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread gnawed at him until his stomach growled loudly in the quiet. After several minutes of resisting, hunger won. He moved to the table, telling himself he would just take a slice of bread, but soon he had eaten the entire meal. An hour passed in peaceful silence. Perhaps, he reasoned, the owner was away, sheltering from the storm somewhere else. He finished the dishes, drank deeply from the cup, and emptied the carafe. The fire crackled warmly before him as he pulled out the letter about his recovered ship. Only that morning he'd felt hopeful, yet now all those plans were gone once more. He let the letter fall to the table and pushed it aside. Without even realizing it, Laurent drifted into a heavy, exhausted sleep. Laurent slept deeply through the night without a single dream. When morning came, it took him a moment to recall where he was. The fire had long since burned out, and the dishes and glasses he had used still sat on the table. It seemed the owner of the house had not returned. Feeling increasingly embarrassed for having entered a stranger's home uninvited, his shame overwhelmed him. Rather than wait for the master of the estate to appear, Laurent decided it was best to slip away quietly and continue his journey. After all, he told himself, the meal would have gone uneaten anyway. Rising from the upholstered chair, he crossed the room and pulled open the double doors. Soft daylight filtered into the entrance hall, giving him a much clearer view than the night before. Moving hesitantly through the foyer, he found himself tiptoeing between the rigid, watchful suits of armor, as though they might suddenly spring to life and block his escape. Looking around at the twin staircases, he noticed their carpet runners were worn and dusty, as if no one had lived here for a long while. He moved quickly across the stone floor toward the huge front door. Grasping the handles, he tugged hard until it slowly opened, revealing a mist-filled courtyard. Squeezing through the gap and shutting the door behind him, he straightened his waistcoat, trying to regain some dignity. Sneaking out like a thief felt dishonorable, but he was determined to forget this entire humiliating detour. Hurrying back to the sheltered alcove where he had left his horse, he was relieved to find her safe. Reaching into his saddlebag, he pulled out the last apple from the provisions Camille had prepared and offered it to her. After untying the reins, he began leading her down the stone path he had stumbled along during the storm. Before leaving, he turned for one last look at the mansion rising starkly in the growing light. It was a massive chateau, long, pale, and rectangular, with a central block flanked by two identical wings. Tall, narrow windows lined both floors in strict rows, giving the impression that the house itself was watching him. Above, the sloped roof bristled with chimneys. Turning away from the imposing sight, he guided his horse toward the front gate, noticing the overgrown gardens on both sides of the path. Nearing the end of the walkway, he spotted a beautiful pergola engulfed in rose vines. In the middle of the circular seating area stood a rose bush, heavy with breathtaking pink blossoms, the most magnificent roses he had ever seen. At once, he remembered Camille's request. Determined to keep his promise, he eagerly began cutting several roses with the knife he kept in his bag. One flower would hardly be enough to make up for his failure. He decided he would bring them all. So focused was he on his task that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps. But as he stepped back from the now bare rosebush, a prickling sensation told him he was no longer alone. Towering above him stood a fierce-looking figure. At least, he assumed it was a man. The stranger had the shape of a human, but his face was nearly hidden beneath wild, bristling hair, and his frame was unusually tall and powerfully built. He looked as though he had rushed out without care for appearance, wearing a wrinkled linen shirt and breeches. His fury was unmistakable. "What do you think you're doing?" the man growled, his voice more like a wolf than a person. Laurent froze, painfully aware of the bouquet clutched in his hand. Haltingly, he tried to explain that he believed the estate was abandoned, that he assumed no one would miss the roses. Seeing no softening in the stranger's harsh expression, Laurent ended weakly by saying he had promised his daughter some flowers. The wild-looking man stood rigidly, weighing his words before speaking again. Straightening to his full height, he said, "You helped yourself to my shelter without permission. You ate my food. You slept in my chair. All of that I intended to let pass without confrontation. But now you have stripped every blossom from my most cherished rosebush. It holds great personal meaning for me. There is no other like it, and each flower is priceless in my eyes. I expect you to compensate me." Hearing this declaration, Laurent felt his heart drop. Shaking his head helplessly, he confessed that he had nothing to offer, not a single coin. The stern-faced master of the estate regarded Laurent with a cold, unreadable expression. "In that case," he said flatly, "you will have to work off your debt. I require laborers here." Laurent stared at him, trying desperately to think of another solution. "But sir," he stammered, "I have 6 children waiting for me at home. I cannot remain here indefinitely. What will happen to them?" The man showed no hint of sympathy. "Either you stay and repay what you owe," he replied, "or someone from your family must come in your place." He gestured dismissively toward the roses. "Take them. They mean nothing to me now. Go home and make your arrangements. I expect you, or whoever you send, to return within 1 week. If you fail to appear, I will come find you." With that, the towering, wild-looking figure turned sharply and strode back toward the mansion without glancing over his shoulder, disappearing into the shadows of the chateau. Laurent stood frozen, realizing he had no choice but to return home and confess what had happened. Somehow, he would have to arrange matters so his children could manage without him. Perhaps, he hoped, once the master had cooled his temper, he might not hold Laurent in service for long. With the storm gone and daylight guiding him, Laurent retraced his route back to the main road and continued toward home. He rode slowly, weighed down by the terrible news he would soon have to deliver. The day was beautiful, the mist lifted, and the gentle autumn sun warmed his face. Birds sang as though nothing were wrong, but Laurent's heart felt heavy with dread. He arrived home late that night. His children rushed out eagerly, expecting lavish gifts. They rummaged through his saddlebags in excitement, only to find nothing but the roses. With a pang of regret, Laurent handed each of them a flower. Camille accepted hers with quiet delight, marveling at its beauty. The other 5, however, immediately demanded their real presence. That evening, seated tightly around the kitchen table, Laurent told them everything. His fruitless journey to the port, the loss of his last chance at rebuilding their fortune, and the circumstances that now tied him to the mysterious owner of the chateau. When he revealed he would have to return to work off his debt, the older siblings reacted with outrage. They protested loudly, complaining about how they were supposed to survive without him. Camille alone said nothing. She sat deep in thought, her expression unreadable. Finally, she cleared her throat and asked her siblings to be quiet. They stared at her in surprise. Camille rarely asserted herself. She calmly announced that she would go to the chateau in her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He immediately refused, insisting he could never allow such a sacrifice. But Camille's logic was difficult to deny. Her father was needed at home far more than she was. She, meanwhile, had developed useful household skills and would manage whatever work was required, cleaning, cooking, anything. There was no other practical solution. She would be the one to repay the family's debt. It took her a day or two to gather her few belongings. As the rose her father had brought began to fade, she pressed it between the pages of a book, wanting a keepsake to remind her why she was leaving home for the service of a fearsome stranger in an isolated estate. Though nervous about abandoning everything familiar, Camille was determined to make her father proud. The morning she was to leave dawned bright and clear. She and Laurent loaded her small cart, harnessed their faithful horse, and set off. The chateau was 2 days' travel by cart, and Laurent knew of an inn where they could rest for the night. Her siblings stood outside the cottage to see them off, a mixture of relief and unspoken admiration on their faces. They were comforted by the knowledge that they wouldn't be left alone for long. The journey was somber for both Laurent and Camille. The weather held fair through the first day, and their night at the inn passed without incident. The second day, however, arrived cold and blustery as autumn began to take hold of the forest. Brown leaves tumbled across the path, and the wind moaned through the trees. Their loyal horse plodded steadily on, carrying them closer to their destination and their parting. When Laurent spotted the narrow road that branched off toward the chateau, his heart clenched painfully. Camille, noticing his growing distress, reached over and gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Father," she said gently. "I'm capable. I'll be all right." He nodded, hoping with all his heart that she was right. Soon, they reached the bleak entrance of the estate. Laurent knew the moment had come. Opening the gate once more, he led the horse through and approached the intimidating mansion for a second time. Part 2. Camille gazed in awe at the sight before her. The expansive, overgrown gardens and the towering, unyielding walls of the mansion were more magnificent than anything she had ever encountered. It felt intimidating, yet stunning in its stark beauty. Having grown up in a small village, she was struck speechless by its vastness and sensed something ancient and mysterious about it, as though the very stones had been resting quietly for ages, waiting to be discovered again. She wondered what tasks would be expected of her here, hoping none would be beyond what she was capable of. Laurent halted the horse at the wide stone steps. The wind swept sharply across them, almost as if trying to push them away from the imposing doorway. Slowly, he climbed the steps, lifted the heavy door knocker, and let it fall. Father and daughter waited together, bracing themselves for the appearance of the fierce master of the house. Instead, the door opened just a crack, revealing a boy of about 13. Dressed plainly in villager's clothes, he peered at them with open curiosity. Once he seemed satisfied with what he saw, he nodded. "Are one of you the new servant?" he asked. Laurent hesitated in surprise before explaining that he had brought his daughter Camille, who would be fulfilling the debt in his place. The boy accepted this without question and pulled the door wider, motioning for Camille to step inside. He then told Laurent to leave her belongings in the grand foyer and go. With that, the boy darted away into the depths of the mansion, presumably to deliver the news that the new servant had arrived. With the wind pushing at her back, Camille stepped through the doorway and into the beginning of her new life. The farewell between father and daughter was emotional, though both made an effort to stay composed. Laurent turned the horse toward home as the gloomy sky hung low over them, and neither looked back until they had passed beyond the gates. Then the forest swallowed them from view. Left alone in the vast entry hall, Camille stood uncertainly. Grey daylight filtered through the tall windows above the door, but the cold light did nothing to make the space feel welcoming. Fighting the urge to shiver, she moved closer to her trunk and told herself she would need to summon bravery and do her best. A few minutes later, the boy returned, breathless, and announced that the Baron had instructed him to take her to her room. Cheerfully grabbing her trunk, he hauled it up the sweeping staircase. Camille followed, surprised they were ascending rather than heading toward a kitchen or servant quarters. Perhaps she would be placed in the attic, she thought. But instead of climbing further, the boy turned down the first grand corridor. They walked quietly along the richly carpeted east wing, passing portraits of noble figures from generations past. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, as though she were an intruder in their long, silent home. Camille was so captivated by them that she nearly ran into the boy when he stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. She stepped inside and found herself in the most beautifully furnished bedroom she had ever set foot in. It wasn't enormous, but everything in it was refined. A canopied bed, rich fabrics and polished woodwork. A cozy window seat and a small dressing table completed the room. While she took it all in, the boy set to work building a fire in the hearth. Once the flames were burning steadily, he dusted off his hands and flashed her a grin. "I'm Gabriel," he said. "I help the Baron around here with all sorts of things. I'm glad you're here. It gets lonely sometimes, and I could really use another pair of hands." Camille wasn't sure what to say. She wondered what all sorts of things might entail, but instead she thanked him for the fire and asked when she would meet her new employer. Gabriel explained that the Baron would see her the following day and would explain her duties then. For now, he would bring her a simple supper, and he hoped she would sleep well. Just as quickly as he had appeared, Gabriel slipped out of the room and closed the door behind him. Camille took a moment to steady herself before unpacking. She hung her clothes in the spacious wardrobe and arranged her small stack of books on the bedside table. Opening the top one, she looked at the pink rose pressed between the pages. With a bittersweet smile, she closed the book and set it aside. Then she crossed to the window, drew back the heavy curtains, and settled into the plush pillows of the window seat. From her perch at the window seat, Camille had a wide view of the courtyard below, its garden paths choked with wild growth, vines crawling up the stone walls of the chateau. Twilight was settling in, and gusts of wind sent leaves and twigs skittering across the paving stones in little spirals. Dark clouds drifted across the rising moon. Worn out from the long journey and the shock of this new life, she drifted into a light sleep, wrapped in the curtain's embrace. A knock at the door startled her awake. She slipped out of the window seat, took a steadying breath, and opened it. A tray had been left on the floor: bread, cheese, a bowl of soup, and a cup of hot tea. The hallway was empty. Gabriel clearly moved like a whisper. She carried the tray to the small table by the fire. Hunger hit her all at once. She ate every bite. Too tired to bother with much preparation, she pulled back the bed covers, slipped beneath the warm sheets, and fell asleep almost instantly. That night Camille dreamed strangely. She found herself wandering the dark corridors of the chateau, following a large dog. The animal darted into rooms and reappeared moments later, always ahead of her. She chased after it until she reached a doorway it had just vanished through. Peering inside, she did not see a dog at all, but the back of a man seated at a desk. The figure began to turn toward her, and just before his face came into view, she woke. Sitting upright, she saw the fire had burned low and morning light was streaming through the window. Another knock sounded. Gabriel stood outside with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Camille," he said politely. "I brought you some breakfast, and the Baron asks that you come to his study when you've finished." She nodded, accepted the tray, and he disappeared again. An hour later, Camille stood nervously outside the very room where her father had once eaten his unintended supper. She heard papers shifting inside. Clearing her throat, she knocked softly. The sound stopped. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a heavily bearded man. His features were harsh and pronounced, giving him a naturally severe expression. He was undeniably intimidating, but Camille kept her face calm and dipped her head respectfully. He examined her for a moment before acknowledging her with a curt nod and motioning for her to sit near the fire. Then he settled into the chair opposite her. "So," he began, You are the one taking on your father's debt. Are you familiar with household work, cleaning, basic cooking?" Camille nodded. He seemed satisfied. Reaching to a nearby table, he picked up a large ring of keys. "As you can see," he said, "I have very little help here. Gabriel handles my basic needs, and his mother brings me bread, milk, and eggs each day. He also runs errands in town. But apart from that, I manage the estate alone. That should be obvious by the state of things." He paused, perhaps expecting a comment, but Camille simply waited. "It is far too much work for just Gabriel and me," he continued, "but we will make do. These keys will open most of the rooms. You won't need many of them, but should you require something Gabriel cannot provide, come to me. Otherwise, I prefer you make whatever household decisions you think best. I spend most of my time in my study or the library." Overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was assigning to her, Camille could only nod again. Sensing the conversation was over, the Baron rose abruptly. Camille stood as well, accepted the ancient ring of keys, and bowed her head politely. As she reached the doorway, his voice stopped her. "Dinner is at 7. It would be wise for you to join me in the dining room." She nodded quickly, thanked him, and stepped out. Camille found herself once more in the cavernous front hall, feeling both dwarfed by the space and oddly hemmed in by it. She spread the heavy keys across her palm, staring at them thoughtfully. She had no idea what any of the locks belonged to, yet the keys radiated a quiet sense of authority. She was pulled from her thoughts when she noticed Gabriel emerging from the shadows. Gabriel beamed at her and asked if she'd like a tour. Grateful for any guidance, Camille agreed, and so began her new life as the housekeeper of the chateau. She soon learned that her employer had lived in isolation for many years. Because of his fearsome appearance, the people in the nearby villages avoided him, traded cruel rumors, and treated him harshly whenever he ventured into town. Gabriel was the only person who linked him to the outside world. The boy had once been hired to run errands, but over time, he grew to admire the man hidden beneath the intimidating exterior. He insisted that the Baron's growl was worse than his bite. Each day, Gabriel worked in the chateau, tending to whatever tasks he could. At night, he returned to the small home he shared with his family on the outskirts of town. "Truly, miss," he insisted, "the Baron is fair and kind-hearted once you know him." Gabriel guided Camille through the halls and numerous rooms of the vast estate, most of which had fallen into deep neglect. Almost every door her keys opened led to another bedroom under sheets of dust. The fireplaces were unused, the furniture draped in cobwebs, and many rooms had clearly been untouched for decades, some possibly for centuries. Light barely filtered through the windows, their glass dulled by layers of grime. She discovered that there were only a handful of rooms that saw daily use and therefore must take priority: the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the front entry hall. The most remarkable room, however, was the library. Gabriel allowed her to peek inside while the Baron was elsewhere, and she felt breathless at the sight. A massive chamber with high ceilings and gold trim stretched out before her. Bookshelves climbed to dizzying heights along every wall except where a window broke the pattern. Rolling ladders stood ready to glide along the shelves, offering access to any book a visitor might desire. There were more books than she could possibly count: spines in deep crimson, forest green, navy blue, rich browns, each inviting her to pull it down and linger. Camille had always cherished the few books she owned during her father's financial downfall, but she had never dreamed of a collection like this. Gabriel explained that the Baron spent most of his time in this sanctuary, and the evidence was everywhere. Tables piled with open volumes, stacks grouped neatly by subject, and 2 worn leather chairs that spoke of long hours lost in thought. He added seriously that it was his job to keep the fire burning in the enormous hearth all day. Camille imagined herself sinking into one of those chairs, opening a heavy tome, breathing in the scent of ink and age. It was almost intoxicating. Still, she knew the only way to tame this neglected estate was to choose one task and begin. That first day, she and Gabriel dusted and scrubbed the front hall, then turned to the kitchen. Gabriel and the Baron had prepared simple meals there for years, but much of the space had been left uncared for. Camille wasn't an expert cook, yet she found joy in bringing the kitchen back to life, clearing dusty counters, polishing pots and pans, and restoring order to the long-neglected room. She sent Gabriel into town with a list of supplies to be delivered. Then, alone in the cavernous kitchen, she continued working. The once cold and empty space slowly felt warm again. By the time she needed to prepare dinner for the Baron, she had managed a modest meal of roasted chicken. Simple, but she was proud of it. With a little time to straighten herself up, Camille returned to her room. Gabriel had already rekindled the fire, and she used the water pitcher and washstand to freshen up before putting on her nicest dress. Crossing to the window to close the curtains for the evening, she paused. Outside, the courtyard was utterly still. Not a bird in sight, not a branch shifting. It felt as though the grounds were under an enchantment of silence. Drawing the velvet drapes together, she stepped away. There was so much she had yet to learn about this place. Lighting a candle, she walked down the dim hallway, descended the wide staircase, and approached the tall doors of the dining room. The chamber inside was far too grand for just 2 people. Once, it must have hosted glittering celebrations and lavish formal dinners. Above, a sparkling crystal chandelier hung like a canopy of stars. Gabriel had set 2 places. At the far end of the long dining table, 2 place settings had been arranged, and the evening meal was already waiting. Camille arrived first, but she didn't have long to herself. The Baron's large, lumbering figure appeared in the doorway, pausing awkwardly before giving her a brief nod of greeting. Then he gestured toward the chairs, indicating she should sit. Camille gratefully took one of the upholstered seats. "I can see you've been busy with Gabriel today," the Baron remarked, lifting his brows at the generous dinner she'd prepared. "He has carried the weight of this place alone for years. I'm glad you'll be able to share some of his responsibilities." Camille nodded, unsure what to say. When she addressed him formally, "My lord," he lifted a hand and shook his head. "Please just call me Antoine," he said. "I am lord of nothing now, only of this chateau and its collection of dusty relics," he added with a dark hint of humor. Then, meeting her gaze, he continued more softly. "I'm sorry you were forced to come here under such circumstances. I hope you'll be comfortable. I try to be fair, and I am grateful for the company." Camille offered a small smile. "Would you like me to tidy the library tomorrow?" she asked gently. "I wasn't sure if I should enter." Antoine considered this, then nodded. "That will be fine," he said, "and you are free to borrow any book you wish. As Descartes said, the reading of all good books is like a conversation with the finest minds of past centuries. You'll find my library has an unusual talent for producing almost any book you can imagine. It is rather magical." Surprised by his graciousness and his eloquence, Camille studied her unfortunate-looking host as he ate. She had been at the chateau only one day, yet her view of her situation was already shifting. Here she was, mistress of a large house, entrusted with real responsibility, and she had been welcomed into a magnificent library unlike anything she had ever seen. Perhaps this unexpected turn of her life would not be as bleak as she had feared. She lowered her gaze to her plate in the flickering firelight, hearing nothing but the soft clink of silverware on china. They did not speak much during supper, but the quiet felt respectful rather than strained. Later, tucked beneath crisp white sheets in her elegant canopy bed, Camille allowed herself a rare moment of hope. This secluded estate likely held many hidden mysteries, and she felt eager to uncover them in time. Turning onto her side, she looked at the tightly drawn drapes. Somewhere within the chateau, a flame of life, warmth, or perhaps possibility seemed to be burning steadily. She could feel it. The next morning, after tending to the kitchen, Camille approached the library with caution. She knew the Baron was in his other study and decided it was a good moment to explore, under the excuse of cleaning, of course. Taking a duster, she moved slowly around the stacks and tables, brushing away layers of long-settled dust. As she reached for a pile of books, Antoine suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Please don't disturb the stacks or any open volumes," he said. Camille stepped back quickly, apologizing. He softened his voice. "There's no need to be sorry. I know it looks disordered. I just don't want to lose my place. I'm in the middle of some research." Then he asked if she had chosen a book for herself. Camille admitted she hadn't, and hesitantly confessed that she felt unqualified to read such distinguished works, given her modest upbringing. Antoine smiled and spread his hands. "Recognizing your own ignorance is the beginning of wisdom," he said. Seeing her puzzled look, he added with a playful wink, "Socrates." He crossed the room, selected a small volume from a lower shelf, and handed it to her. "Perhaps you'd enjoy more of his thinking." He believed in asking many questions. Camille accepted the book with gratitude and moved toward the door. Before leaving, however, she turned back. "May I ask one thing?" she said. "Would it be possible to hire some villagers to tidy the gardens before winter?" Antoine's expression grew wistful, and he shrugged. "If Gabriel can find anyone willing to come, then yes. But most are afraid to set foot on the estate. Many wild tales have circulated about me over the years. That is why I live mostly alone." Camille frowned softly. "How do you bear it? Doesn't it anger you, being treated so unjustly?" The Baron lowered his eyes. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when I was a handsome man, and a vain, foolish one. It took a great misfortune to teach me humility. If people scorn me now, perhaps it is a fair price for my past mistakes." Camille didn't press him further. She sensed his answer was only a piece of a much larger story, and she intended to learn the rest someday. For now, she was eager to return to her room and begin reading the book by Socrates. As the days passed, Camille quickly settled into her life as the chateau's housekeeper, and to her own surprise, she grew to love it. Camille eventually managed to have Gabriel bring several village men to the estate for a single day to clear the gardens of years of overgrowth. Before they began, she made absolutely certain they understood one thing, that the rose bush near the pergola was not to be touched. Antoine's mother had planted it, Gabriel told her, and it held deep sentimental value for him. She nearly regretted inviting the men at all when she overheard their crude conversation. "They say he's a monster," one man scoffed loudly. "Lives like some wild creature," another added. "No manners. Not fit to be around decent folk." Then with a sneer he finished, "But I'll take his coin just the same." As Camille turned, she saw Antoine standing near the window, having heard every word. Panicking, she hurried to shut it, hoping to spare him any further hurt. He lifted a hand dismissively, seemingly unfazed. "I'm accustomed to such talk," he said calmly. "It has been a very long time since I could appear comfortably in society." Even so, Camille felt distressed on his behalf. "How can you endure such unfairness?" she asked quietly. "People judge you without knowing you. Doesn't it make you despise them?" Antoine gave a small, reflective shrug and looked toward a stack of books on the table. A great English playwright, William Shakespeare, once wrote, "Heat not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself. By extending goodwill toward those who misunderstand me, I lighten the burden on my own heart." Then he offered her a small, sincere smile. "You might enjoy reading Shakespeare. His plays are extraordinary." With that, he returned to his books, leaving Camille to ponder his words and the bleak grey afternoon beyond the window. Part 3. Even with the endless amount of work waiting for her each day, Camille still found time to explore the sprawling house. As autumn fully settled in, with crisp air, early sunsets, and long, chilly evenings, she would wander the corridors by candlelight, using her heavy ring of keys to unlock the countless doors lining the halls. Most of them led to unused bedrooms. It was clear that this grand country chateau had once welcomed distinguished guests and nobility. Now, those elegant chambers sat untouched beneath sheets of dust. Room after dim room revealed ornate four-poster beds, expensive furniture, and chairs draped in faded fabrics. One afternoon, Camille stumbled upon a chamber unlike the rest. A woman's room, still full of her belongings. A graceful dressing table gleamed beneath jars of powders and delicate bottles of perfume sparkling faintly in the afternoon sun. Nearby, elaborate wigs from decades past rested on stands, as if waiting to be chosen for a ball. Opening the wardrobe, Camille gasped. Rows of luxurious silk gowns hung inside, preserved from the days before the revolution. She brushed her fingers lightly across their fragile skirts, half afraid they might crumble at her touch. She tried to imagine the elegant lady who had once worn them. A chest of drawers held dazzling necklaces, and in a small velvet box she found a ring set with a glittering sapphire. Quickly closing it, Camille slid the drawer shut. She didn't want even a hint of impropriety. With a wistful glance around the room, she slipped out and locked the door behind her. It felt like stepping out of a doorway into a happier era, the loveliest room she had discovered so far. Camille faithfully wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel delivered on his trips to town. In them, she reassured Laurent that she was treated with kindness and enjoyed her duties. After her first month, she even began sending home money. The Baron had told her he couldn't allow her to continue working without payment. Her father's debt, he insisted, had long been repaid. He hoped she would stay, and he offered her a weekly wage. Camille accepted gladly. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had found her purpose. Her natural sense of order was put to good use, and the companionship and access to the extraordinary library became some of her greatest pleasures. In time, Antoine's appearance grew easier to overlook. Nothing about his face or frame changed, save that Camille kept his clothing cleaner and more presentable. Yet every so often, when he passed a mirror, she would catch a glimpse of a normal, even handsome man reflected back at her. Or she would be speaking with him and, just for a moment, his features seemed softened. His hair less wild, his expression more refined. She would blink, refocus, and find the same rough, beast-like appearance as before. Perhaps the chateau's lingering magic was toying with her mind, she thought, with a wry half-smile. Occasionally, a beggar would come to the door, driven by the cutting winter wind and unaware of the estate's unpleasant reputation. In her home village, beggars were rarely given help. Most believed that poverty was the fault of the poor themselves. Camille expected Antoine to dismiss them, but instead, he would quietly ask her to give each visitor a handful of coins. Moved by his generosity, she asked why he bothered showing kindness when none was shown to him. He answered by quoting another philosopher he admired, Aristotle. "It is the mark of a magnanimous man," he said, "to seek no favors, but always be ready to perform kindness." Then, with a hint of sadness, he added, "I must learn to be more magnanimous. It was my own past choices that led me to this ruin." She knew better than to push further, but her curiosity deepened. She wanted desperately to understand how Antoine had ended up so isolated and scorned. That evening, they talked comfortably over a hearty winter stew in the soft glow of candlelight. Camille finally found the courage to ask how he had come to live alone in the chateau. Antoine hesitated, sighing deeply as he leaned back. After taking a long drink, he began. "Many years ago, I lived here with my mother. My father had passed when I was still young, and so I inherited this place. I loved my mother dearly. She was beautiful in every way, full of joy, yet always kind. It was her rosebush your father stripped of its blossoms." He paused, clearly uncomfortable, then continued. "When she became ill and died, I was left to my own devices, and I'm ashamed to say I did not live well. I was young, foolish, and reckless. I wasted the family money on extravagant luxuries and foolish entertainments. The estate suffered, the bills went unpaid, and I neglected the people who worked for me." He stared at the table as he spoke. "Without my mother's good influence, I became irresponsible. I was of no worth to anyone, including myself." He paused again, swallowed, and said in a low voice, "One night, during one of my lavish parties, a servant came to tell me a woman was at the door begging for food and a coin. I couldn't be bothered. I told him to send her away, that she should find employment elsewhere." Antoine winced at the memory, clearly haunted by his own past behavior. But before the servant could turn her away, the woman forced her way through the crack in the door and declared that he had been cursed by his own foolish vanity. She told him he would live out his days shunned and unloved, and that the key to breaking the spell could be found only in humanity. Camille frowned slightly. Humanity? What could she have meant by that? Antoine lifted his shoulders in a weary shrug. That is the riddle I have wrestled with for decades, he replied. My library seems to contain an endless supply of books. Works by the wisest philosophers, mathematicians, and poets. The very best of human thought is at my fingertips. No doubt that's part of this strange enchantment. He gave a hollow little laugh. My mind has grown sharper, yes, but all the brilliance of humanity has not yet revealed the cure for my curse. Camille gazed at him thoughtfully across the table. The gentle crackle of the fire was the only sound. She imagined him sitting there through countless winters, night after night, with no one to talk to, turning the pages of ancient books, searching desperately for redemption. Sensing the heavy mood, Antoine brightened and gave her a hopeful smile. Well, he said, the great Isaac Newton once observed that reaching the simplest truth may require years of contemplation. Perhaps one day I'll uncover it. Later that night, curled beneath her blankets, Camille felt she finally understood. For all those long years, Antoine had buried himself in study, reflection, and quiet repentance. He was no longer the man who once turned away a hungry stranger. Now he offered kindness even to those who did not deserve it. Still, she wondered what more he could do. Would he remain trapped forever among his books and the dusty reminders of the man he once had been? She hoped not. She had grown to admire him deeply. Pulling the covers up beneath her chin, she watched the last embers glowing faintly in the hearth, and soon drifted off to sleep. Throughout the bitter winter, Camille and Antoine moved through their days in peaceful companionship, with Gabriel serving as their cheerful link to the outside world. Most of the mansion remained locked and unused, but the rooms they relied on were always warm and tidy, thanks to Camille's careful attention. Their meals were simple, yet comforting. Snow piled high in the courtyard, and the wind sometimes hummed down the deserted hallways, but inside they stayed close to the fireplaces, absorbed in their books. At last, signs of spring appeared. With the thaw came a letter from Camille's father. Her eldest sister had secured a marriage arrangement, and the wedding was set for a few weeks' time. He asked whether the Baron might permit Camille a short leave to attend. When Camille presented the request, Antoine set his book aside and looked at her with a gentle, melancholy smile. Of course, he said, you must go. Take whatever time you need. As she thanked him, the illusion struck her again. She did not see a beast, but simply a man. She had to blink several times before the image faded and the familiar roughness returned. She left the room, glancing back once over her shoulder before letting the moment go. Her journey to the wedding passed without incident. Her family welcomed her warmly, filled with curiosity and even a bit of newfound respect. They admired the modest but tasteful clothing she had purchased with her wages, and it was clear that the money she sent home had helped secure her sister's marriage. Their family was no longer viewed as impoverished. Rather, they were seen as respectable and stable. Yet Camille felt strangely out of place in the cottage where she had once belonged. Though she had spent months closed in behind the walls of the chateau, she felt as though her world had widened far beyond the village. Sitting by the fire while her siblings fussed over trivial matters, she found herself feeling confined. She regretted parting from her father once again, but she also felt relieved when he bid her farewell at the estate gates. Camille was ready to return to her role as mistress of the house. Her relief quickly turned to alarm when she stepped inside. The chateau was in complete disorder. Gabriel flung the door open with excitement, clearly thrilled to see her return. But behind him was a scene of chaos. He whispered to her that nothing had been the same since she left, and that the Baron had become disheveled and withdrawn, barely leaving the library. After unpacking her belongings, Camille headed straight there. When she pushed open the library door, her heart sank. The room was a disaster. Books scattered everywhere, lying open across chairs, stacked unevenly on the floor. Empty glasses cluttered every surface. Antoine slumped in a chair, looking as if he hadn't changed his shirt in days. At the sound of her entrance, he looked up with an expression of guilty relief. And once again, Camille experienced the strange illusion. In that moment, she saw not a beast, but an ordinary man, someone weary, lonely, and desperately in need of encouragement. It took her a moment to see him clearly again, unshaven, unkempt, and decidedly beast-like. Yes, definitely in need of cheering. It took only a few days for Camille to restore order. The dust and disorder of a couple of weeks were easily managed, and Antoine's mood lifted noticeably the moment she returned. Yet Gabriel confessed privately that he hoped she would never leave again. The Baron had sunk immediately into terrible melancholy during her absence, barely managing to function, even forgetting to eat. With spring bursting into bloom around the estate, it was hard to remain unhappy for long. Camille was grateful she had arranged for the gardens to be cleared before winter. Now the courtyard was breathtaking. The carefully designed beds, planted long ago by Antoine's mother, were showing their brilliance once more. Flowers appeared in every shade imaginable, and birds sang joyfully each morning as if urging the residents to come outside. Camille and Antoine spent many afternoons reading beneath the pergola, and he often excused Gabriel early so the boy could enjoy time with friends. Camille delighted in throwing open the mansion's long shut windows, letting fresh air sweep through the halls. Life at the chateau felt renewed, as if the entire place had finally awakened. As summer approached, Camille received another letter from her father. Her second sister was now preparing to marry, and Camille was invited to the celebration. She felt torn. She wanted to support her family, but she couldn't imagine leaving Antoine again. After much thought, she came up with a bold and unexpected idea. She suggested that Antoine accompany her to the wedding and stay at a nearby inn. Antoine was horrified. "Have you not seen how people react to me?" he demanded. Camille had anticipated this. She explained that her own village was far from the chateau. No one there would know him or judge him based on rumors. Privately, Camille no longer saw him as frightening at all. She saw only the wise, gentle man she had grown to trust. To her, the oddity of a nobleman attending a village wedding didn't matter. She had long since stopped thinking of him as either beast or baron. He refused again and again, until Camille said firmly that she would not go unless he went with her. Faced with the thought of disappointing her, Antoine finally agreed. Still, he dreaded the event and brooded darkly as preparations began. But Camille persisted. She sent Gabrielle into town with instructions for a tailor to make Antoine a new, properly fitted suit. She had long noticed that his clothes were outdated, frilly relics from another era. Modern styles were simpler, cleaner. A dignified suit would help him appear less like a figure from centuries past. Rooms at the inn were booked, and the carriage was cleaned and aired out. At last, the day arrived. Gabriel wished them a pleasant journey, astonished to see the Baron leaving the estate at all, and promised to keep everything in order until their return. The ride to Camille's village was quick by carriage, just a single day. And it was a beautiful day, summer beginning to unfurl with lush abundance as they travelled through the forest. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, dappling the path in shifting gold. At first, Antoine sat stiffly, as though resisting the reality of being out in public. But after a few miles, Camille mentioned a book she had been reading, and soon the two were deep in conversation, just as they always were. Camille couldn't help smiling. When she saw the best version of him, she truly felt as though a charming gentleman sat beside her. She did not question the illusion. She simply enjoyed it. Eventually, twilight descended, and crickets began their nightly chorus as they neared the village. Antoine and Camille arrived at her family's cottage and stopped the carriage. The moment they stepped down, her entire family crowded into the doorway, her 4 unmarried siblings staring openly and impolitely at both of them. Laurent showed far better manners. He stepped forward, nodded respectfully to Antoine, and thanked him for escorting Camille and for honoring the family with his presence. But Camille's face burned with embarrassment when her brother leaned toward her older sister and whispered something that made the girl snicker. It was obvious they were making crude jokes about the Baron. Everyone seemed relieved once Antoine left for his lodging. Camille allowed her family to usher her inside, where she spent the rest of the evening chatting with her father and siblings, politely asking about the wedding plans. Yet her thoughts were elsewhere. She worried how Antoine was being treated at the inn and hoped he wasn't enduring cruelty. As she lay in bed later that night, she drifted to sleep thinking of him. She realized she would be glad once the wedding was over and they could return to the chateau, the place that now truly felt like home. Her fears were confirmed the next morning at the church. The moment they entered, Camille could feel the congregation's eyes fixed on them. The small church suddenly seemed even smaller, as though every single person was assessing and judging them. The reception afterward took place on the village green. It was a simple but cheerful affair with sweet punch, cakes, and bunches of wildflowers adorning the tables. Children rolled in the grass, laughing, while groups of women nibbled delicately at pastries. But Camille and Antoine did not feel welcome. She stood close beside him, stiff and tense, as the villagers, once so warm and generous to her, kept their distance. These were the same people who had taught her to bake and garden years ago. Yet now they whispered behind their hands and cast knowing glances her way. Not a single neighbor spoke kindly to Antoine, though he offered every one of them a polite smile and no complaint. Her own family was no better. They ignored the pair entirely. As Camille and Antoine stood there, silently praying the festivities would end, they overheard 2 men speaking nearby. "He may have money," one man said with a sneer, "but no woman would ever marry someone with a face like that." The second man chuckled. Sad business when a man has to chase after his own maid. That was the breaking point. Camille set down her punch, strode to the center of the gathering, and announced loudly that she had something to say, and that everyone must listen. "I asked the Baron to come with me because I believed you were good people," she said. "I thought that if you saw his character, his kindness, you would realize he is not the monster you claim he is. But I was wrong. None of you are deserving of his regard." She swept her gaze over the silent crowd. "Let me tell you this. Antoine is a better man than any of you here. I would choose him as my companion over every one of you 100 times, and that is the truth." The entire gathering fell silent. People stared between Camille and Antoine in stunned confusion, and when Camille turned toward him, she saw something astonishing. Standing where the Baron had been moments earlier was a handsome, dignified man, smiling at her with deep gratitude. No matter how many times she blinked or tried to refocus, the change did not reverse. The wild hair, the exaggerated features, the imposing proportions were gone for good. He looked as handsome as any man she had ever known, and he remained that way. Whether it was her perception shifting or an actual enchantment finally breaking, the villagers seemed completely unaware anything unusual had occurred. They greeted Antoine warmly, smiled at Camille, and behaved as though nothing strange had happened. It was as if the humiliating scene outside had never taken place. The people treated Antoine as though they had never seen a beast at all. The transformation was both baffling and miraculous. A veil had lifted forever. This quiet, triumphant moment marked the end of Antoine's curse. He had spent years searching through books for answers, convinced the solution lay in the brilliance of human thought. But he had misunderstood the meaning of the woman's riddle. Through long, solitary years of learning to be kind, generous, and patient, he had developed the very humanity that touched Camille's heart. That was the missing piece. That was what set him free. Not long after, Camille and Antoine sat together beneath the pergola in his garden, admiring his mother's rose bush, now blooming in magnificent abundance. Twilight settled once more over the chateau, and the evening crickets began their soft chorus as the happy pair enjoyed the warm summer air. Camille studied this new, transformed Antoine, his handsome features no longer hidden beneath the guise of a beast. As she watched him, he straightened slightly and reached into his pocket, drawing out the very ring she had once admired in secret from his mother's old dressing table. "You were the only one who bothered to know me as I truly was," he told her. Then, in familiar fashion, he added a quote from one of his many books. As Copernicus wrote, "At the center of everything lies the sun, and you have become that sun for me." With a playful wink, he continued, "And besides, I believe you've already proven that you're more than capable of managing this entire chateau." Camille laughed and nodded, allowing him to slide the sparkling sapphire onto her finger. She gazed at it in amazement, remembering the first moment she had seen it among the dresses and jewelry in that mysterious lady's chamber. How it had glinted in the sunlight as though sharing a secret with her. Now she realized she was becoming part of the chateau's history. Before summer ended, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the chateau's courtyard, surrounded by the heavenly perfume of blooming roses and the sweet birdsong drifting from the treetops. As they stood beneath the shadow of the great house, Camille looked at Antoine with gratitude and a profound sense of belonging. This was no longer the forlorn estate she had first arrived at a year ago. Through kindness, patience, and a shared pursuit of wisdom, she and Antoine had finally discovered true happiness together.